He does a sort of verbal jujitsu as Socrates is confounding the other participants in the dialogue, who are all praising love, this god Eros, or in Latin called Cupid. They're praising Eros as beautiful. And he says, no, actually, Eros is want. And there's this pun, which is definitely there in English, and I suppose is there in Greek as well, that to want something is to desire it, but it also is, in the more archaic usage in English, to want something is to lack it.
Welcome to Communion and Shalom.
In this podcast, we are exploring how the biblical and historic Christian faith can engage sexuality, ethnicity, culture, and our local communities as we pursue the flourishing of God's kingdom. Our goal is to engage these topics charitably and with nuance.
TJ and I spoke with our friend Kathryn about how marriage, romance, desire, and attraction have been viewed differently in Western history. We hit on several topics that come up in many Christian conversations about love and marriage. We learned so much, we wanted to share it with you in full. So we're releasing it in 3 chunks for ease of listening. In this part, we discussed the word eros, one of the Greek words for love, and how different people use it and define it. Which is important because this word is used a lot in the Christian church to talk about marriage or romantic relationships. But it turns out this word is not as clean-cut as you might think. Then, in part 2, Kathryn talks us through a literary history of Christian marriage, sex, and what we might now call romance in the West, starting with the ancient Greeks. For anyone who has had to work through their expectations for romantic relationships, or other people's expectations for your relationships, part 2 is for you. Part 3 is then our follow-up and response to that history, and exploring its implications going forward. I hope you'll join us as we dive into the historical roots of our modern love relationships. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another podcast episode of Communion and Shalom. We're really excited here today to have both TJ and I here with our good friend, Kathryn. Kathryn is working at a Christian Studies Center at Duke and has a PhD in medieval literature. Is that the most? I should know this better. Yeah.
No. I was in the English department, but my specialty is medieval, specifically late medieval religious writing. But I'm going to be speaking today out of my general sense of this sort of sweep of literary history too.
So we originally met Kathryn at school. We all attended the same school program for a while. And then consequently, we've been friends since then. We particularly wanted to talk with her in this episode to start talking about Eros and romance, these ideas and these concepts, and start to, as Kathryn put it, disambiguate Eros particularly, to try to talk about the different strands that engage like the desire and the attraction that we might think both of these terms invoke somehow. So we would like to, I think, talk first about some of the terms that we're going to employ, and then we'll discuss a particular podcast series which is relevant. And then we'll probably in the end move into more of a historical reflection that Kathryn can provide us. This emerges because in the side B conversation movement, there's a complexity with the idea of romance and eros and how it's often been used in the circles around us, maybe in the more contemporary Christian, sometimes Protestant, sometimes Catholic sort of circles. So we wanted to get someone who studies this, who can actually provide us a new kind of vantage point or kind of new ways of thinking about these things that would be helpful to improve the conversation moving forward so people can have more wisdom and knowledge to engage the conversation in particular.
I just want to say thanks so much. I'm really honored to be on your wonderful podcast.
Thank you.
And have a chance to catch up with you guys.
Yeah, definitely. So let's first start with Eros as kind of a first key term.
So most people have encountered Eros probably through C.S. Lewis's The Four Loves.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting Greek word that we would often call romantic love or sexual love. And it is not a Greek word that's actually used in the New Testament. I believe the 2 Greek words for love that are used in the New Testament are phileo and agape.
I think Eros is used in the Septuagint translation,
which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament.
Yep, but you're right. Not in the New Testament. Yeah.
So it's a word that was used in their days, but didn't pertinently come up in any New Testament explicit conversations.
Mm-hmm. I studied Greek in my undergraduate studies, and our professor was pretty intent on the point that C.S. Lewis's Four Loves is like a systemization that was formed for his purposes, and that it doesn't exactly emerge organically from the biblical text.
Yeah, that's, if you would have walked up to someone on the street and been like, so there's these 4 type of loves, they'd be like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
And they're like, well, they hear these different words and they use them in different contexts. They're different words,
Mm-hmm.
but they wouldn't have systematized it into kind of these different spheres of life as thoroughly as Lewis does.
Yeah. So that was what my Greek professor taught me. I'm curious what you think about that, Kathryn, as well. This is like a later systemization of Four Loves, which was not this like the implicit way that people might have used the terms originally, which is fine, of course, but it's just sort of a transitional point. But now that it's become a more dominant framework among at least some U.S. Protestants and maybe Catholics, maybe Orthodox, about how to think about these different loves and concepts and divide them up in different ways.
Yeah, I agree that C.S. Lewis, I think Four Loves is so wise. It's a really excellent book. I think that the way that he systematizes and separates is very useful, but of course it is an imposition of a conceptual structure on text from which the meaning of these words will arise in a more confused, more ambiguous way, right? The ancient world doesn't have dictionaries. And so we have clear definitions of some words coming out of like philosophical dialogues. But with these particular words, I think that there's a spectrum of usage.
Sure. Yeah. So, Kathryn, what are your first thoughts as we sort of pursue disambiguating Eros? What a definition we could be using in our podcast?
Well, I think that this conversation is really sort of prompted by a series of sermons that we've all listened to about Eros in the context of theology of the body. So, David, maybe you can start by summarizing those.
So Robert Cunningham is a PCA pastor in Kentucky, and he recently did a conference series called For the Good of the Bluegrass. I encourage you all to check it out, or check out his podcast as well, called Every Square Inch.
And we'll post his sermons in the show notes for anyone who wants to listen to them.
And so he does this 3-part message on that it's titled, the first one is The Revelation of Eros, second one, Redirection of Eros, and the third one is The Resurrection of Eros. So he's kind of looking at creation, fall, redemption of Eros, of how this is a part of God's created order, and how really anything in the created order has to be rooted in the kind of God's eternal glory. And even more so, since we are image bearers and this is part of our experience, that this is a window into the Trinitarian love. There's no love that we could be expressing or experiencing that is not more deeply rooted in the Trinity's eternal loving relationship. And so he dives deeply into that, yes, as Kathryn was saying, off of mainly using Pope John Paul's theology of the body to really develop a theology of sexuality, theology of sex and romance and love. And he kind of hones it around Eros and tries to help people not just have a negative idea of erotic, something like dirty, erotic literature, but to see, no, like Songs of Solomon is holy erotic literature. And that is both, like, that is an expression of marital love, conjugal love, and which is a window into God's love, which is rooted in the Trinity, but then shared with us as Christ takes the church as his bride. And the kind of middle part would just be, he talks about the fall, of saying that when love became disordered at the fall, that Eros got contorted into lust. Rather than it being a window in which we could understand God's love, it became this kind of just self-serving, that like really, truly like no longer love, but just desire turned in upon itself. So he holds up Eros extremely highly as the highest kind of created natural love that serves a temporary purpose. Really, like, well, in its present sexual expression in marriage, that it forms this like really valuable purpose of helping us know God's love. But then in the resurrection, when Jesus comes and makes all things new, that marriage comes to an end, as Jesus says. But Eros doesn't come to an end. It comes to its fulfillment at the wedding feast of the Lamb, when Christ and his church will be united and experiencing the love of Eros in a deeper, richer way than really we could have only imagined, in which marital love, a sexual romantic love, whatever kind of and this is what we're talking about, like what is that Eros? How do we think about it? But that is pointing to that future resurrection reality. Is that a good summary?
So I think that one of Cunningham's most interesting choices was his use of the same word, eros, to describe a very wide variety of what I would say are different kinds of love, right? That he uses eros to describe the conjugal union, right? Sexual desire. He uses it to describe the Christian's love for God in mysticism, in prayer, in contemplation. And he uses it to describe the love that is between the persons of the Trinity. He says all of these are eros. There is a continuity between these different types of love and desire. They have a deep commonality despite the differences in their expression. And I agree with Cunningham that there is some continuity, but I think it's sort of risky to not emphasize alongside it the ways that these loves are differentiated from each other. So one of those major ways is that eros, we can translate it not only love, but desire, right? And this is a way in which in C.S. Lewis's formulation is different from the love of affection, of friendship. It is a need love. It is a love that is made of lack. Right. And Plato in his Symposium tells us this very clearly. He does a sort of verbal jujitsu as Socrates is confounding the other participants in the dialogue, who are all praising love, this god Eros, or in Latin called Cupid. They're praising Eros as beautiful. And he says, no, actually, Eros is want. And there's this pun, which is definitely there in English, and I suppose is there in Greek as well, that to want something is to desire it, but it also is, in the more archaic usage in English, to want something is to lack it. And so he says, Socrates says that Eros is ugly. Eros is poor, because Eros, the desire, is necessarily in a state of absence, of lack of fulfillment. So this is, I think, one of the things that's behind Andrew Nygrun's famous argument about Eros and agape, right, in which he says that God can only have agape because God has no lack. In the perfect community of the Trinity, there is no absence. There's no yearning or longing for something that isn't there, because God is all in all. So Nygrun will give a very negative connotation to Eros, a very positive connotation to agape, and see really the Christian life as replacing this sort of selfish need love that wants to be fulfilled with the perfect giving love of agape. Now, I don't think that is quite true. I don't think that's quite right. I think that there is a long tradition in Christian poetry, in Christian mysticism, of attributing to God this sort of longing and yearning, right? We see this in scripture, and we see this in mystics of the Middle Ages who speak of God as being even compelled by love, right? That God fell in love, and love forced him to come down and be incarnate and suffer on the cross because he was under the compulsion of love. And we know that when we speak that way, we're speaking metaphorically, right? We're speaking equivocally. We're attributing to God things that we don't literally think, because we see him as impassible, as entirely self-sufficient. And yet there's a way in which the most adequate language that we have for the intensity of God's love is this love of yearning, this love of desire. So that's the tension that we're sort of in. I think that we always have to be aware of the metaphorical valence of language that we're using about God, and especially with Eros, which is such an explosive, powerful force for human beings that we don't want to attribute to God the kind of weakness, out of control, irrational aspects of Eros that we are prone to. So that's one element of disambiguation.
I was thinking, actually with our podcast manager, Elena, she and I attended a symposium on love in the Christian tradition a couple of years back, maybe a year. And we read Nygren, and we saw that differentiation where he did emphasize agape so greatly. So when I listened to Cunningham, I did notice he emphasized like Eros was his key. And that was the thing that kind of he thinks God and all loves, they essentially bow down to. Because he's, in the beginning, he's sort of like, yeah, storge, yeah, philia, yeah, agape.
No, he doesn't mention agape there.
No, he does in the beginning. He mentions those three, and then he's like, an Eros. And then Eros is kind of the thing that holds the highest, the throne, huh? But I'm wondering, Kathryn, where do you position yourself between these two visions of Christian love? Like, how do we bring Eros? Like, what's the position that we could talk about Eros in this conversation? So you said you don't quite agree with Cunningham. You see potential problems with that narration. You see potential problems with Nygren's narration of agape or Eros specifically. Yeah, how can we talk about this in this conversation that would be helpful for the listeners to kind of know what we're saying?
Yeah, here I'm actually I'm gonna draw on the Symposium, not a Christian source, but I think one that is profoundly insightful. So in Diotima's dialogue with Socrates, as she's giving her account of love, in contrast with all the accounts that come before, she's going to speak about Eros, this love of desire, of yearning and longing, as a kind of ladder, right? That the Eros is like an umbrella term, I would say, that is going to cover all of the sorts of love that we experience that involve desire for beauty and desire to possess or to be united with that which is beautiful.
Sure.
So, but that can take many different forms. It can have many different expressions, right? On what Plato calls the lowest level, there's a desire for a beautiful body of a single human being, which is by nature a desire for a kind of immortality through generation. That I see the beauty of the person, I want to be united with that beauty or possess it, and I want to achieve a kind of immortality of love by producing children. Plato says you can go upward on the ladder and desire a beautiful body, not in order to procreate, but in order to help that person grow in virtue. But you can also have a love for a more abstract kind of beauty that's not in physical bodies, but in institutions, like just laws, like amazing art. And they evoke a desire, which is not the same as sexual desire, right? But it has the commonality with it that both of them involve this yearning for the beautiful. And then there's also under the same umbrella of love of desire, you can desire a nature which in the first place is everlasting, not growing and decaying or waxing and waning. Secondly, not fair in one point of view and foul in another, or at one time or in one relation or one place fair, at another time or in another relation or in another place foul. Beauty that is absolute, separate, simple, and everlasting, which without diminution and without increase or any change is imparted to the ever-growing and perishing beauties of all other things. So there we see, he doesn't use the word God, but that's very much what we would understand to be God. You know, that which is not merely possessing beauty for a few years, but which is everlastingly beautiful and imparts beauty to all other things.
Sure.
And so what I would say, we can maybe use the word Eros to refer to this umbrella of loves, the desire for the beautiful, to be united with it. But we should, without great caution, use the same word for any of the particular expressions. And so I would disambiguate and say we can talk Eros in the form of sexual desire, Eros in the form of romantic love. This is the sense in which C.S. Lewis is using the word Eros. And we can talk about Eros as the Christian or the mystic's desire for God, right? That they have some commonality, but they are so different that it's going to be more useful for us to refer to them by different terms.
It seems like in my experience, engaging with Christians, mostly Protestants, usually when they use Eros, they mostly they focus on the sexual. Eros has sexual love. And that's the one that usually is like the one they're going to forefront in these conversations most. Is that right? From kind of your experience of kind of in these spaces where you talk about this term?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of our conversation today is about this relationship between the sexual love and the romantic love. Very difficult to separate them. I think that they are conceptually can be separated, but just in terms of
Yeah.
you can sort of schematically conceptually separate them, but in like life as it is lived, falling in love with someone, the falling in love experience will typically give rise to sexual desire, right? And we can see, from the standpoint of evolutionary psychology, from the just looking at like what biologically happens, that the falling in love experience arises out of our imperative to reproduce, right? It grows out of, or it is a kind of overflowing of something that is fundamentally sexual and is oriented towards the continuation of the species, right? So as rational animals, as people who have culture, we can take something that has one evolutionary natural purpose and we can reinvent it. We can do other things with it, but It is rooted in, right, that sexual drive, which is for procreation. And we can never completely get rid of that linkage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And trying to think of like, okay, how Cunningham is seen. You mentioned the previous, like, oh, what's this want part of it? That even that is like part of our image bearing, that God said it is not good for man to be alone. And that is both the desire of a man for a woman, someone who he can procreate with, someone who he is incapable of fulfilling. I mean, literally the continuation of the species, let alone whatever else God has given humanity to do without the help of his complement, but is also representative of this larger need for community, which is also, again, rooted in the Trinitarian communion. And so sometimes you're like, oh, well, can we try to separate out that sexual? We kind of have, like, we wish we could separate out romance from sexuality, so to maybe keep it more PG or something. And Cunningham would push of like, what is that intrinsic connection that is an important part of our image bearing? Why does God link together intense, passionate, irrational, overwhelming love with creation? How I've always thought of it is like the Trinitarian love was so rich that they didn't have to create to not be lonely, but they were so not lonely that they overflowed and created the entire universe. And we see that same like eruption from marital love, that it erupts into creating new image bearers, new persons. And so I'm just kind of in tension with, I see the benefit for other reasons that I'm sure we'll talk about more of helping distinguish these. But I don't want them to be like, I see the whole picture as it comes together as a really beautiful thing, and as a revelation of who God is and how he's trying to pour that into creation.
Yeah, I think that God has made us and he designed our biology, right? He designed our evolutionary strategies in such a way as to give rise to rational creatures who are able to worship him and to know him. So like take a different kind of love as an example. We're a species that reproduces sexually with differentiation of male and female roles. We're a species that has there's like R strategies and K strategies. Like we're a species that does not scatter semen everywhere like a fish and try to have as many children as possible. And then like most of them die. But if you have enough, some of them will survive. We're a species that has very, very intensive dedication to a smaller number of children. We're a species that has an incredibly long period of maturation, that children are born utterly helpless and vulnerable and dependent. And they spend many years in that state of dependence. Why did God design us this way? Right? In order that by knowing human families, right, by having relationships with fathers and mothers, we would learn what it is to love. Right, that like we would have hardwired into us on a biological level these relationships of dependence, which are not simply relationships of dominance and submission or of power and weakness, but are relationships of mutual care and tenderness. Right. So it's through this biological reproductive strategy, he gives us sort of the hardware, which we can then use to love him, right? To love other people who are not biologically related to us. So we're taking sort of the equipment, right? The circuits, which are laid down in us in our biological reproduction of our distant ancestors, and we can use it for new purposes. We can use it in a way that is not oriented towards reproduction and survival of our species, right? But is oriented towards love of God, who is a spirit. And I think in a similar way, our sexual desire, our sexual love is laying down a certain hardware that we can write new programs onto, right? It's giving us certain equipment for loving that can then be used for other purposes as well.
And this using it in a new way, but it's almost like with some type of embedded originality. Like we're not taking like a father-daughter relationship and then completely like malcontorting it and trying to use it for something that just is like really alien to itself. But we're learning like from the goodness of a father-daughter relationship or father-son relationship. And you talked about how like all this is like metaphorical, but they're God designed metaphors that is embedded in let's say like in a spiritual reality.
Yeah, absolutely. God is not constrained by like raw materials that he has to make do with, right? He made our animal nature, our biological nature on purpose as a kind of embodied metaphor by which we could come to know him. And that's part of his design from the beginning.
We're stopping this episode here, but don't miss part 2 of this conversation, where we get into the honestly fascinating history of how romance in marriage, or outside of it, has changed over time in Western culture. So check out part 2 if you want to hear the full story. Thanks as always for listening, and see you next time. Hey listeners, I want to let you know about the Communion and Shalom Patreon. Joining the Patreon community not only supports this podcast, but gives you the opportunity to listen to bonus content, give input on future episodes, and submit questions for a patron-only Q&A. We're so thankful for the support and encouragement from so many listeners, and we hope that this podcast continues to be meaningful to you.